The only sound was the panicked rasp of her own breathing, a ragged counterpoint to the shriek of the wind through the pines. Each gulp of air was a draft of ice that burned its way down into her lungs. She ran. She did not know where she was running to, only what she was running from. The fine white silk of her wedding dress, a garment that had cost more than a good horse, was now a tattered ruin, snagged by branches, stained with the dark, wet earth of the forest floor. The delicate slippers were long gone, her stockinged feet numb and bleeding against the cold. Sharp stones and pine needles that littered her path. Terror was a hard, cold knot just below her ribs, a constant companion that had been growing for months. Now, it was a living thing, spurring her onward even as her muscles screamed in protest. The forest was an alien place, a world of deepening shadows and unfamiliar shapes. She was a creature of gaslit parlors and manicured gardens, wholly unprepared for the raw, untamed wilderness of the Colorado Rockies. Yet here she was, fleeing a gilded cage for a wild one, with no certainty of survival in either. A memory, sharp as a shard of glass, pierced through her panic. Silas Croft, his hand on her arm. His fingers were always cool, his touch possessive, less an embrace than a claim of ownership. She could feel the ghost of his grip even now, a faint ache that echoed the deeper bruise on her spirit. Their courtship had been a transaction, a cold piece of arithmetic orchestrated by her father to settle his staggering gambling debts. She was the final chip to be played, a daughter traded for solvency. Silas had never pretended it was a matter of the heart. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, assessed her as they would a prize mare, noting her breeding, her temperament, and her potential for producing an heir. His words were always polished, but beneath the veneer of civility lay the veiled threat of a man accustomed to absolute control. "A wife, my dear Alara," he had told her once. His voice a silken murmur, "is like a fine watch, beautiful to look at, but her true value lies in her perfect, silent obedience to her master's hand." The memory that had finally broken her, the one that fueled this desperate flight, was the most recent. It had happened just hours ago, on the eve of their wedding, hidden in the alcove of her father's study. She had overheard Silas speaking with his men, his voice thick with brandy and arrogance. One of them had asked if he was not worried about her spirited nature. Silas had laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "She has a bit of fire, it is true," he'd said, the words slithering under the door. "But that is of no consequence. A wild horse is of no use until it is broken. I look forward to the challenge of breaking her in. She will learn her place soon enough." The crude metaphor had struck her with the force of a physical blow. In that moment, the future laid itself bare before her, a lifetime of submission to a man whose cruelty was a quiet, patient thing. She saw herself fading, her spirit slowly extinguished until all that remained was a beautiful, empty shell. That was a fate worse than any death the wilderness could offer. So she had run. She had slipped out a side door while the house was filled with the noise of pre-wedding revelry, taking nothing but the dress on her back and the terror in her heart. The wind, which had been a brisk slap against her cheeks, now began to howl with a new and terrifying ferocity. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, was now choked with clouds the color of a deep bruise. The first flakes of snow came hesitantly, then in a sudden, blinding rush. What had been a cold afternoon was descending into a full-blown blizzard with a speed that defied belief. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The trees, once her only landmarks, transformed into skeletal apparitions, their bare branches clawing at the thick, gray air. The snow was no longer falling. It was being driven sideways, a horizontal wall of ice that stung her exposed skin like 1,000 tiny needles. Her tracks, the only proof of her passage, were erased almost as soon as she made them. The path ahead and the path behind were identical curtains of white. The cold, once a sharp discomfort, became a physical weight. a crushing presence that seeped through the ruined silk and into her very bones. It leached the strength from her limbs, slowing her desperate run to a stumbling walk, and then to a pathetic, shuffling crawl. The sharp knot of terror in her stomach began to dissolve, replaced by a creeping, insidious numbness. The burning in her lungs eased, the fear quieted. A strange, fatalistic calm settled over her. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps this was the end. It would be a cold death, but it would be a free one. Her legs gave out from under her. She fell into a drift of snow. The impact soft, almost welcoming. The white flakes began to cover her, a gentle shroud tucking her in for a final sleep. Her body had given up. Her will was flickering, a guttering candle flame in the face of the gale. As her eyelids grew heavy, as the world of white began to fade to a soft, inviting gray, she saw it, a light. It was faint, a single, impossibly small spark of orange flickering in the distance. It was so small she thought it might be a trick of her fading mind, a final, cruel mirage. But it held steady. Hope is a painful thing when you have already made your peace with dying. It surged through her, an agonizing jolt that brought the feeling back to her frozen limbs. It was a command. Live! She did not have the strength to stand. So she crawled. She clawed her way through the snow, her fingers raw, her mind fixed on that single point of light. It was a beacon in an indifferent universe. Each foot was a victory, each yard a testament to a primal instinct she never knew she possessed. The light grew, resolving itself into the shape of a window, a small, glowing square against the dark bulk of a cabin. She reached it, her strength utterly spent. The rough-hewn logs of the wall were solid beneath her trembling hands. She pulled herself up, her body a dead weight, and collapsed against the door. With the last dregs of her consciousness, she raised a fist that felt like a block of ice and knocked. It was not a knock so much as a weak, muffled thud, a sound that was surely swallowed by the roaring symphony of the storm. And then there was only darkness. Inside the cabin, Caleb Blackwood moved with the quiet economy of a man long accustomed to solitude. He was in his early 30s, but the lines etched around his eyes and mouth spoke of a much older soul. He placed another log on the fire, the flames leaping up to lick at the fresh pine, casting dancing shadows across the single room. The blizzard was a familiar sound to him, the howl of the wind a seasonal neighbor he knew how to prepare for. His cabin was a bastion of order against the mountain's chaos. Firewood was stacked neatly against one wall, enough to last a month if need be. Bundles of dried herbs, yarrow, sage, and mint hung from the rafters, scenting the air with the ghosts of summer. A small stack of worn books rested on a crate beside his cot, their spines softened with use. He had made a kind of peace with loneliness, a peace born from a sorrow so deep it had scoured him clean of any desire for the company of men. The nearby town of Prosperity held nothing for him but suspicious glances and muttered insults. Here, on his mountain, he was accountable only to the seasons and to himself. He was part of the landscape, weathered and resilient as the granite peaks that surrounded him. He was listening to the storm, attuned to its rhythms. When he heard it, it was a sound that did not belong. Through the constant, deep-throated roar of the wind, there was a faint thud against his door. It was soft, unnatural. His body went still, every sense on high alert. No animal would make such a noise, and no sane person would be out in this weather. The people of Prosperity thought him a savage, but even a savage knew when to stay by the fire. His first thought was trouble. His hand went to the worn handle of the hunting knife sheathed at his belt, his knuckles brushing against the familiar leather. He moved to the door, his steps silent on the packed earth floor, and pressed his ear against the thick wood. There was nothing but the wind. He hesitated, then slowly, carefully, lifted the heavy bar that secured the door. He opened it just a crack, the wind tearing at it, a blast of snow and ice invading the warmth of his cabin. The sight that greeted him stopped the breath in his chest. It was a woman, or the ghost of one. She was half buried in the snowdrift that had accumulated against his door, a crumpled heap of white fabric and pale skin. She looked like a porcelain doll someone had carelessly discarded, her fine dress torn and sullied, her dark hair fanned out against the snow. For a long moment, Caleb was frozen by the sheer impossibility of it all. Women like her, in dresses like that, did not simply appear on his doorstep in the middle of a killer blizzard. They belonged to another world, a world of carriages and comfort he had long since left behind. He saw the unnatural blue tint of her lips, the delicate frost that clung to her eyelashes like tiny diamonds. He saw the faint, violent tremor that was the only sign of the life still fighting within her. Something inside him, a part of him he thought had died and been buried years ago, cracked, the hard shell of his solitude, built from years of loss and bitter experience, shattered in an instant. He was not thinking of the strangeness of it, or the danger. He was acting on an instinct more fundamental than suspicion. He pushed the door wide, letting the storm rage into his home, and scooped her up into his arms. She was shockingly light, as if she were made of nothing more than silk and bone. He carried her inside, fighting the wind that tried to rip her from his grasp, and with a powerful heave, slammed the door shut and dropped the bar back into place. The howl of the blizzard was instantly muffled, the world beyond the four walls of his cabin ceasing to exist. He laid her down on his cot, the only soft place in the room, pulling it closer to the hearth. The firelight flickered across her pale face, revealing the stark lines of exhaustion and fear. His movements were practical, born of necessity, not tenderness. There was no time for gentle courtesies when death was a guest in the room. His focus was singular: save her life. He worked with a detached, clinical efficiency. The frozen, wet dress was a death shroud. He took his knife and carefully slit the delicate laces up the back, his fingers clumsy against the fine fabric. He peeled the icy layers away from her skin, his gaze averted, his mind focused only on the task. As he removed the bodice, he saw them, dark bruises on the pale skin of her upper arms, the distinct shape of a man's powerful grip. The sight confirmed a grim suspicion, a silent story of the kind of world she must have fled, a world far crueler than any blizzard. He covered her immediately with his thickest wool blankets, chafing her icy hands and feet between his own warm, calloused palms. He worked methodically, trying to force the life back into her limbs, to fight off the frostbite that was already claiming her. She was barely conscious, her body racked by shivers so violent they seemed capable of shaking her apart. Her breath was a shallow, ragged whisper in the quiet cabin. The night stretched into an eternity. A silent battle waged in the heart of the storm. Caleb brewed a hot, thin broth from dried jerky and wild herbs, the savory steam filling the small space. He lifted her head, cradling it with one hand, and used a spoon to force spoonfuls of the warm liquid between her chattering teeth. Most of it dribbled down her chin, but some of it went down. It was something. He did not sleep. He sat on a low stool by the cot, a silent, watchful guardian. He kept the fire fed, the cabin a pocket of warmth against the raging cold. In her brief moments of semi-consciousness, her eyes would flutter open, wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the storm. They would fix on him, a stranger looming over her in the firelight, and she would flinch. A small, involuntary movement of pure fear. He moved slowly, deliberately, trying to show her she was safe, though he knew that for a woman who bore the bruises he had seen, the word safe had likely lost all meaning. He understood then that she was not just fleeing the weather. She was fleeing a man. He looked at her fragile form, lost in his rough blankets, and saw not weakness, but a profound and desperate strength. The strength it had taken to run. The strength it had taken to crawl through a blizzard to his door. The deepest hours of the night came, and with them, the deepest cold. Her shivering did not stop. If anything, it grew worse. Her teeth chattered with a frantic, rattling rhythm. The blankets were not enough. Her skin, where he touched her forehead, was still alarmingly cold. He knew the signs. He had seen it before. If her core temperature dropped any further, her heart would simply stop. The fire could not warm her from the inside out. The broth was not enough. He stood, pacing the small confines of the cabin, his mind at war with itself. He knew what he had to do. It was the oldest, most basic way to fight the killing cold. But the thought of it was a violation of the solitude he had so fiercely guarded for so long. To lie with a stranger, to share the intimate space of his cot. It went against every instinct he had honed over years of isolation. But the alternative was to sit here and watch her die. He looked at her, at the faint, fluttering pulse in her throat. And the battle was over. Her life was more important than his solitude. After a moment of profound hesitation, a conflict between his ingrained loneliness and the stark, brutal necessity of the moment, he made his decision. He pulled off his heavy wool shirt, leaving him in his thin undershirt, and gently pushed her onto her side. He lay down on the narrow cot behind her, his back to the wall. He hesitated for a breath, then wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. It was an act of profound, almost shocking intimacy, yet there was nothing of lust in it. It was a sharing of the most fundamental thing he had to give, the heat of his own life. He was a solid, warm presence against her back, a human barrier against the cold. For Ilara, drifting in a delirium of cold and fear, the sensation was a distant anchor in a swirling nightmare. It was the first human touch she had felt in a long time that did not feel like a threat, like a cage closing around her. It felt like safety. Subconsciously, her trembling body settled against his, seeking the source of the warmth. Slowly, miraculously, her violent shivers began to subside, easing into a manageable tremor. For Caleb, the feeling was deeply and powerfully unsettling. He could feel the fragile beat of her heart against his back, the slightness of her form in his arms. It had been years since he had held anyone. The simple, human contact awakened a part of him he had thought buried forever with his past. A quiet ache of tenderness he had no name for. He had offered a stranger his blanket to save her from the cold. But in this desperate, silent act, in sharing the very warmth of his own body, he had inadvertently begun to share the one thing he guarded most fiercely of all, his heart. Outside, the blizzard roared, an indifferent and monstrous thing. But inside the small cabin, two strangers clung to each other for warmth, a tiny, fragile island of life in the midst of the storm. The world outside the cabin ceased to be a place of trees and mountains and became a howling whiteness, an endless, roaring void. For 3 days, the blizzard raged without pause, imprisoning them in the small, fire-lit space. The cabin, which had been a last, desperate hope for Ilara, became her entire universe. Time lost its normal shape, measured not by the sun, but by the rhythmic addition of logs to the fire and the slow melting of snow for water. Ilara drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if surfacing from a great and suffocating depth. Her first awareness was not of sight or sound, but of sensation. The rough comfort of a wool blanket against her skin, the savory, unfamiliar taste of broth on her tongue, a warmth that spread slowly through her chilled body, the constant, hypnotic crackle of the fire in the stone hearth. She existed in this state of fragile awareness for what felt like an eternity, her body too weak to move, her mind a fog of exhaustion and lingering fear. When her eyes could finally focus, she saw him. He was a man of quiet, deliberate movements. She would watch him from the cot, her gaze half hidden by the heavy blanket. She watched his broad back as he split kindling with a small hatchet, the muscles in his shoulders shifting beneath his worn shirt. She watched him tend the fire, check the security of the door, and move about the small space with a quiet competence that was at once intimidating and deeply reassuring. He was a part of this wild place, as sturdy and self-contained as the ancient pines outside. Her fear of him, a reflexive terror born of her experience with Silas, was a cornered animal in her heart. Every time he turned suddenly or his shadow fell across her, it would startle and flinch, but the fear began to recede, starved by a lack of threat. He never moved too quickly. He never stood too close for too long. He never looked at her with the possessive, assessing gaze she had come to expect from men. His eyes, a deep and guarded brown, would meet hers briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement, and then move away. He was giving her space, a commodity she had never truly known. The fear was slowly, cautiously being replaced by curiosity. She started to notice the details. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who lived by them, but she saw them move with an unexpected gentleness. He would spend hours by the firelight carving a piece of scrap wood, the knife turning it from a block into something with shape and life. One afternoon, he checked the dressings on her frost-bitten fingers, which he had wrapped in a poultice of herbs. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet so careful it made an ache start in her chest. It was the touch of a healer, not a captor. Their first conversations were sparse, essential things. Words dropped into the vast silence like stones into a deep well. "Do you need more water?" he would ask, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "Yes, thank you," she would whisper, her own voice thin and strange in her ears. "The fire needs another log." "Are you hungry?" These simple exchanges were all that passed between them for the first 2 days. Yet, in the spaces between the words, a deeper communication was unfolding. He never asked her name. He never asked where she came from, or what she was running from in a wedding dress in the middle of the mountains. He never asked a single question that would force her to revisit the trauma that had driven her to his door. His silence was not empty. It was respectful. It was a gift, the greatest one he could have offered. It allowed her to feel, for the very first time, that her story was her own to keep or to tell. By the 3rd day, a measure of strength had returned to her limbs. She was able to sit up on the cot on her own, the cabin no longer swimming before her eyes. The urge to contribute, to be something more than a helpless burden, was a powerful one. It began with a small act. She folded the blanket he had put over her, smoothing it with trembling hands. He noticed, giving a short, single nod of acknowledgement. The next day, when he was preparing a simple meal of stewed rabbit, she swung her legs off the cot and stood, swaying for a moment. "I can help," she said, the words coming out stronger than before. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You should rest." "I have been resting," she insisted. "Please, let me help." He hesitated, then handed her a knife and a few wild carrots. Her hands, accustomed to embroidery needles and piano keys, were clumsy with the unfamiliar tools of a rustic kitchen. She fumbled with the knife, her cuts uneven. He did not criticize. He simply took another knife and worked beside her in silence. This shared work, this quiet, practical partnership, became a language of its own. It was a way of building something together, a fragile bridge of trust across the chasm of their different worlds. With her returning strength came a greater awareness of her surroundings. The cabin was one room, built of sturdy, hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. It was starkly utilitarian. A cot, a small table with 2 stools, a stone fireplace for heat and cooking, shelves holding dried goods in tins and jars. But her eyes kept being drawn to the rough mantelpiece above the fire. There, in stark contrast to the cabin's Spartan nature, sat a single object, a small bird, carved from a pale wood, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. It was exquisitely detailed, each feather rendered with a loving, patient hand. It was the only object in the entire cabin that served no practical purpose. It was a piece of pure, unadorned beauty. It was a glimpse of the man beneath the hardened survivalist, a crack in the wall he kept around himself. One evening, as the firelight made the little bird's shadow dance on the wall, She found the courage to ask, "Did you make this?" she asked, her voice soft. Caleb, who was cleaning his rifle, stopped his work. He followed her gaze to the mantel. A shudder came down over his face, his expression closing off so completely it was as if he had retreated to a place deep inside himself where no one could follow. "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "It is very beautiful." He did not reply for a long moment. He just stared at the bird, his jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his words were clipped, final. "I made it a long time ago." The conversation was over. The moment passed, but it left a profound impression on Alara. She understood that his walls were high for a reason, that they were built on a foundation of some old, deep pain. Later, her curiosity piqued. She examined the small shelf of books by his cot. She saw Shakespeare, a worn volume of poetry, and a book on geology. He was not the uneducated mountain man Silas would have scornfully described. He was something else entirely, a man of hidden depths and guarded sorrows. On the fourth night, the blizzard's fury began to wane. The constant, deafening roar of the wind subsided into a mournful, intermittent sigh. The world outside was still a wall of white, but the relentless assault was over. They sat by the fire, the silence between them no longer a void to be filled, but a comfortable, shared space. Alara felt a debt of trust, a need to answer the questions he had never asked. She decided to speak. "My name is Alara Vance," she said into the quiet. He looked up from the fire, his eyes meeting hers. He waited. She told him her story. It did not come out in a torrent of tears or a rush of frantic words. She spoke in a quiet, measured voice that trembled with the weight of a trauma she was still processing. She told him of her father, a good man made weak by his love of cards, and the mountain of debt that had crushed their family. She told him about Silas Croft, a man from a world of wealth and power, who had agreed to erase that debt in exchange for her hand in marriage. "It was a business arrangement," she said, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I was a piece of property, to be transferred from my father's ledger to his—" She described Silas's cold hands, his possessive gaze that made her feel like a fly trapped in amber. She spoke of the chilling realization that her life was to be one of silent servitude, her only purpose to be a beautiful ornament and to provide an heir. She told him about the conversation she had overheard, Silas's cruel boast of breaking her in, like a horse. "I realized that he would not just own my life," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "He would take pleasure in extinguishing my spirit. And I could not let that happen, so I ran." Telling the story aloud was both a release and a wound. To give the fears a name, to speak them into the safe, warm air of the cabin, felt like lancing a poisoned boil. Caleb listened without interruption, his face impassive in the firelight, but his attention was absolute. He did not offer platitudes or pity. He offered her the dignity of his silent, unwavering presence, and in that, she felt a profound validation. When she finished, the silence returned. But it was different now, filled with the shape of her truth. After a long time, he spoke, his voice low and rough with an emotion she could not name. "This world has a long history of men who see everything as something to be owned," he said, his gaze distant. "Land, gold, people." He looked at her then, his eyes holding a deep, shared understanding of what it meant to be seen as less than human. And, in return for her story, he gave her a piece of his own. He did not tell her everything, but he told her enough. He told her of the nearby town, Prosperity, a name dripping with irony. He said it was founded on a gold strike, built on a foundation of greed and prejudice. Then, he told her about himself. "My father was a white man, a trapper," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "He came here before the gold rush. My mother, she was Paiute. She was of these mountains." He explained the impossible space he had been forced to occupy his entire life, belonging to neither world, To the Paiute, he was the son of the white man. To the people in town, he was a half-breed, a word he uttered with a quiet, bitter contempt. He was a thing of the wild, not to be trusted. He paused, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. "I was not always alone here," he said, the words costing him a visible effort. "I had a family once, a wife, Lena, and a daughter, Sarah." He gestured with his chin towards the small wooden bird on the mantelpiece. Sarah loved birds. She thought they were magic, to be able to fly so high. His voice grew thick with a grief that was still raw. Years later, there was a sickness that swept through the valley a few years back. Diphtheria. It took Lena first. Then it came for Sarah. I rode to Prosperity for the doctor. I begged him. But men like your Silas, they have their predecessors. The doctor was beholden to the mine owner, a man who saw no profit in saving a savage's child. He told me he was too busy. He said he would come when he could. Caleb's voice broke on the last words. He came 2 days later. It was too late. The revelation struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. It recast everything she thought she knew about him. His solitude was not a choice. It was a painful, bitter exile. His hardened exterior was not a sign of coldness, but a shield built around a heart that had been shattered. She understood that his kindness to her, his gentle care, was not born of simple pity. It was born of a deep, personal understanding of loss, injustice, and the cruelty of the world. This shared vulnerability was the true thawing, a melting of the ice that had encased both their hearts. It transformed their relationship from one of rescuer and rescued to one of equals. They were two wounded souls, finding a strange and unexpected solace in each other's presence. Without thinking, Ilara reached out and placed her hand on his, a simple, instinctive gesture of comfort. His hand was rough and hard beneath hers, but it was warm. A current, electric and unspoken, passed between them. He did not pull away. He simply turned his hand over and let his fingers rest against hers. They sat there for a long time as the fire burned down to glowing embers, the silence now filled with a profound, shared understanding. In the days that followed, a new dynamic emerged between them. As Ilara's strength fully returned, Caleb began to teach her. He was a patient, methodical instructor. He showed her how to read the clouds to predict the weather, how to stack firewood so the inner pieces would always stay dry, how to set a simple snare for rabbits. For Ilara, who had been raised to be ornamental, whose only skills were in things that served no purpose in this world, it was a revelation. She discovered a competence within herself she never knew she possessed. Each small success, a perfectly set snare, a neatly stacked wood pile, was a quiet victory, a piece of herself she was reclaiming from the helpless woman she had been. One afternoon, he taught her how to sharpen his hunting knife on a whetstone. The small cabin was filled with the rhythmic, scraping sound. "You hold it steady," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Keep the angle the same all the way to the tip." Her hands were unsteady. He moved behind her to guide them, his body pressing lightly against her back. His hands covered hers, positioning her fingers on the knife's handle, guiding her movements on the stone. The sudden proximity was overwhelming. The world shrank to the space between them. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his chest against her back, the strength in the hands that held hers. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, pine, and the clean, masculine scent of him. The simple, practical lesson became charged with an unspoken tension. He paused, his hands still covering hers. The scraping sound stopped. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the fire and their shared, quiet breaths. The desire that had been simmering beneath the surface of their shared survival rose, powerful and undeniable. It was a desire born not of simple loneliness, but of a deep emotional intimacy, of seeing the true and honorable soul of the person beside you. He was no longer just her rescuer, and she was no longer his patient. They were a man and a woman, bound by a storm and a shared understanding of pain. The spell was broken when the world outside changed. A new quality of light, pale and thin, began to filter through the cabin's single, grime-covered window. Caleb released her hands and stepped back, moving to the window to scrape away a patch of frost. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a ray of pure, unfiltered sunlight streamed into the cabin. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, transforming the small, rough space into something beautiful, something sacred. It felt like a sanctuary. But the sunlight was a double-edged sword. It meant the storm, the thing that had both threatened her life and created this impossible refuge, was finally over. It meant the outside world, with all its dangers, with men like Silas Croft, was no longer held at bay. Their period of grace, the fragile peace they had forged in the heart of the blizzard, had come to an end. The sunlight that broke the storm was a harsh and brilliant thing. After days spent in the amber glow of the fire, the light reflecting off the unbroken blanket of new snow was a physical blow, forcing them to squint. The cabin, which had been their entire world, a shelter from the raging blizzard, now felt small and confining, charged with the unreleased electricity that had sparked between them over the whetstone. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the memory of his hands on hers. Caleb broke the silence. "We need to go outside." He opened the door, and the change was absolute. The world had been remade. Every sharp edge of the landscape was softened, every peak and valley smoothed over by a deep, pristine layer of white. The pine trees wore heavy coats of snow, their branches bowed as if in prayer. The silence was profound, a stark contrast to the blizzard's roar. It was a world cleansed, beautiful, and utterly alien. Alara gasped, the sheer, breathtaking majesty of it stealing the air from her lungs. Caleb's voice, practical and low, cut through her awe. "Do not look at it for too long. The glare will burn your eyes." He handed her a strip of dark cloth with 2 small slits cut in it. "Tie this around your head. It is not much, but it will help." His pragmatism was an anchor in the face of such overwhelming beauty. As she adjusted the makeshift snow goggles, he pointed with his chin towards a gentle-looking drift near the cabin. "The snow hides everything. That drift could be covering a 10-foot drop between those rocks, and the snow muffles sound. Anything could approach, and you would not hear it until it was right on top of you." He looked at her, his expression serious. "Predators, or men. The world is not safer just because it is quiet." His words were a necessary splash of cold water, reminding her that while the storm inside the cabin had begun to pass, the dangers of the world had only been held in abeyance. Their supply of dried meat was nearly gone. The storm had lasted longer than Caleb had anticipated, and survival was a matter of constant planning. "We need fresh meat," he announced the next morning. "I'm going hunting." Alara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach at the thought of being left alone. She had grown accustomed to his steady presence, to the security it provided. She said nothing, but her apprehension must have shown on her face. Caleb watched her for a long moment, a flicker of some internal debate in his eyes. To his own surprise as much as hers, he heard himself say, "You should come with me." He rationalized it immediately. "You need to learn. You cannot stay in this cabin forever. You need to know how to move through this country, how to provide for yourself." But the truth, the deeper truth he would not admit even to himself, was that he did not want to leave her, and he did not want to be alone anymore. The silence of the forest, once a comfort, now seemed an empty thing without her in it. He had been busy the day before, stretching and working a green deer hide over wooden frames. He presented her with a pair of crudely made but functional snowshoes, smaller than his own. "It will be slow going at first," he said, showing her how to tie the leather straps over the worn men's boots he had stuffed with wool for her. "Walk flat-footed. Do not try to lift your knees too high." The journey through the snow-laden forest was a revelation for Ilara. At first, she was clumsy, tripping over the wide snowshoes, her muscles aching with the unfamiliar strain. But Caleb was a patient teacher. He showed her how to read the story written in the snow, the delicate, hopping tracks of a snowshoe hare, the deeper, deliberate prints of a deer, the predatory trail of a coyote. He taught her how to move silently, placing each foot with care, using the trees for cover, becoming a shadow in a world of white and gray. Through his eyes, the wilderness began to transform. It was no longer the terrifying, malevolent entity that had nearly claimed her life. It was a complex and logical place, governed by harsh, impartial laws of survival. There was a beauty in its brutal honesty, a clarity that was absent in the world of men she had fled, with its hidden motives and polite cruelties. Here, hunger was honest. The cold was honest. Life and death were honest. She felt a strength blooming in her she never knew she possessed, a sense of capability that was more valuable than any jewel she had ever worn. They had been tracking a lone buck for over an hour when Caleb held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. He pointed to a granite outcropping ahead, a jumble of massive boulders that offered a perfect vantage point over a small, sheltered clearing. They moved toward it with painstaking slowness, crouching low. The cold was intense, seeping through their layers of clothing. Huddled together in the narrow space behind the largest boulder, they waited. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft puff of their own breath turning to vapor in the frigid air. The proximity, necessary for warmth and concealment, was overwhelming. Her shoulder was pressed against his, their legs touching from thigh to ankle. She could feel the solid strength of him, the steady, slow rhythm of his breathing. The unreleased tension from the cabin returned, magnified by the cold and the charged stillness of the hunt. "He will likely come through that pass," Caleb whispered, his voice a low vibration against her ear. He shifted the long rifle he carried. "You should know how to use this." He maneuvered the heavy rifle into her hands. It was cold and impossibly heavy. "Settle the stock against your shoulder," he instructed, his voice close, "firmly, or the kick will break your collarbone." He moved behind her, his body a warm wall against her back, his arms coming around her to help her position the weapon. He adjusted her grip, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. His chest was pressed against her shoulders, his chin near her temple. His breath was a warm cloud on her neck, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Her scent, a faint and clean smell of the soap he used and something uniquely her own, filled his senses, clouding his focus. The buck they were tracking, the hunt, the very need for survival, all of it faded away. The vast, snow-covered world shrank to the small, charged space between their two bodies. The cold, the hunger, the danger. None of it mattered. The only reality was the warmth of his breath, the solid feel of his chest against her back, the strength in the arms that encircled her. He felt the change in her, a subtle shift in the way she held herself. He slowly released his hold on the rifle, his hands resting on her arms. He was no longer the teacher. She was no longer the student. He turned her to face him, a slow, deliberate movement in the cramped space. His eyes, dark and intense, searched hers, asking a question he did not have the words to speak, a question about the spark that had ignited between them, about the future, about whether this fragile connection forged in a storm could survive the light of day. Ilara gave him her answer. She held his unwavering gaze and leaned into him, closing the small distance that remained between them. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, hungry collision, a raw and honest expression of everything that had been held back. It was a release of all the pent-up fear and grief, the crushing loneliness, the burgeoning desire that had been simmering for weeks. It was a kiss of shared sorrow and the fragile, terrifying hope for a future. It tasted of the cold mountain air and the promise of warmth, of survival and salvation. His lips were firm and chapped, and she met his raw need with her own, her hands coming up to grip his coat, pulling him closer. The spell was shattered by the sharp crack of a breaking branch in the distance. They pulled apart instantly, their senses snapping back to high alert. Caleb's hand was on his knife, his eyes scanning the trees. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. The adrenaline of the kiss replaced by the adrenaline of potential danger. But there was only silence. The deer, startled by the sound, was long gone. But something far more significant, far more vital, had been found in its place. They returned to the cabin in a heavy, charged silence. The dynamic between them had been irrevocably altered. The bridge of trust had been crossed, and there was no going back. They were no longer just companions in survival. They were teetering on the edge of becoming lovers, a truth that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The hunt had been unsuccessful, and their supplies were now dangerously low. There was no more putting it off. "We have to go to Prosperity," Caleb said that evening, his voice flat. "We need flour, salt, ammunition." A cold dread settled over Ilara. Prosperity. The town Caleb had described as a place of greed and prejudice. For him, it was a place of painful memories and hostile glares. For her, it represented the very society she had fled, a world of harsh judgments and suffocating expectations. "They will be looking for me," she said quietly. "I know," he answered. "We will say you are my wife. We are trappers from up north, passing through to sell our furs." It was a simple story, but their lives might depend on its telling. They went together 2 days later, leaving the sanctuary of the mountain behind. The journey down was tense. As they neared the town, Ilara could feel Caleb changing, withdrawing into himself. The open man who had taught her to track and shoot, replaced by the guarded, grim-faced stranger she had first met. He was putting on his armor. Prosperity was a raw gash in the pristine wilderness, a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, huddled in a valley cleared of its trees. The sounds of a saloon piano and the ring of a blacksmith's hammer cut through the cold air, and just as Caleb had predicted, the moment they stepped onto the main street, the staring began. Men stopped their conversations to watch them pass. Their gazes lingered on Ilara, a mixture of crude curiosity and contempt, taking in her worn but still fine-looking coat, then flicking to Caleb with open hostility. She could hear them, the words muttered just loud enough to carry, "Half-breed. Look what the savage dragged down from the mountain. Squaw man." Each word was a stone thrown. Ilara felt a surge of protective anger. She wanted to scream at them, to defend the honor of the man who had saved her life. But she saw the rigid set of Caleb's jaw, the way he stared straight ahead, and she knew that the only thing she could do was to not react, to not give them the satisfaction. She lifted her chin and met their stares, her expression a mask of cool indifference she did not feel. They entered the general store, a cluttered space that smelled of coffee, leather, and chewing tobacco. The storekeeper, a portly man with a sour face, watched them with suspicion as they gathered their supplies: flour, salt, beans, cartridges for the rifle. It was while Caleb was negotiating a price for a few beaver pelts he had brought that Ilara saw it, pinned to a notice board by the door. Amongst advertisements for cattle auctions and claims disputes was a piece of paper that made the blood run cold in her veins. It was a notice, expertly printed, with a charcoal drawing at the top. The drawing was of her, a beautiful, ethereal rendering of Ilara Vance in a lace collar, her expression soft and innocent. It was a version of herself she no longer recognized, a fragile doll from another lifetime. Beneath the drawing, the text was a masterpiece of deceit. It was a message from Silas Croft, offering a substantial reward for any information leading to the safe return of his beloved fiancée, Ilara Vance. It spoke of her being lost and perhaps taken during the terrible storm, painting Silas as a heartbroken, worried man, desperate to be reunited with his lost bride. The lie was so audacious, so complete. It made her physically sick. She felt a wave of dizziness, reaching out a hand to steady herself against a barrel of nails. Her movement caught the attention of a man who had just entered the store. He wore a tin star on his chest. Sheriff Bartlett. He was a big man, running to fat with a self-important air and small, shrewd eyes that took in everything. His gaze slid from the poster to Alara, then to Caleb. "You folks new in town?" the sheriff asked, his voice a lazy drawl that held an undercurrent of authority. Caleb turned from the counter. "Passing through," he said, his voice curt. The sheriff's eyes lingered on Alara, a flicker of recognition dawning. He looked back at the poster. "This woman, she bears a resemblance to your wife." "Lots of women look alike," Caleb said, his body language a solid wall of defiance. He moved to stand slightly in front of Alara. "That's so." Bartlett took a step closer, his aggression focused entirely on Caleb. "Where you folks headed from?" "North." "North is a big place. What is your name?" "Blackwood." Alara watched, her heart pounding. She saw the contempt on the sheriff's face, the ingrained prejudice that made him immediately see Caleb as a threat, a liar, a lesser being. She saw Caleb standing his ground, protecting her, willing to face down this man and the entire town for her. In that moment, something shifted inside her. The last vestiges of the frightened, helpless woman she had been were burned away, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. She had chosen her side. She found her voice, and when she spoke, it was steady and clear, without a trace of the fear that was churning in her stomach. "My husband is a man of few words. Sheriff," she said, stepping out from behind Caleb to stand beside him. She met Bartlett's gaze directly. "We have had a long journey," as he said. "My name is Mrs. Blackwood. Is there some problem?" Her words, her confident tone, and her proprietary use of "my husband" took the sheriff by surprise. He looked from her to Caleb and back again, his certainty wavering. She was no frightened, captive woman. She was defiant. He grunted, clearly dissatisfied but unwilling to challenge a white woman who seemed to be in her right mind. "Just be sure you are passing through," he said, his voice laced with menace. "We do not like your kind stirring up trouble here in Prosperity." Caleb paid for their supplies, and they left the store, the eyes of the entire town following them. They walked out of Prosperity without looking back, the new weight of their supplies a heavy burden, but not as heavy as the new dread that had settled between them. The journey back up the mountain was silent. The charged electric tension of the morning had been replaced by something cold and sharp. The sanctuary of their cabin, once a haven, now felt incredibly fragile. Its location known, its peace shattered. They were no longer just hiding from the elements. They were being actively hunted, with a price on Alara's head. They reached the cabin as dusk was falling, the setting sun painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of orange and purple. The beauty was lost on them. They stood at the door of their small home and looked at each other, the unspoken truth hanging in the frigid air between them. Silas was close. His influence had reached this far, and the fight for their lives, for their right to exist together, had just begun. The silence on the journey back up the mountain was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was nothing like the comfortable quiet they had shared in the cabin. This was a silence born of fear, each unspoken thought a weight between them. The poster had changed everything. The threat of Silas Croft was no longer an abstract shadow from Alara's past, but a concrete and imminent danger with a price posted on a public wall. He was here. He was hunting her, and Caleb was now his target, too. When they reached the cabin, the sense of it being a sanctuary was gone. It felt tainted, exposed. What had been a refuge now seemed a fragile trap. Every gust of wind whistling through the pines sounded like an approaching footstep. Every snap of a frozen twig was the cocking of a rifle. The easy, burgeoning intimacy that had blossomed between them in the heart of the storm withered under the harsh glare of this new reality, replaced by a shared, gnawing anxiety. Caleb changed. The patient teacher, the gentle companion, retreated behind the walls of the hardened survivalist. His silences grew deeper, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, his ears attuned to the slightest unnatural sound. He spent an entire evening by the fire, not carving wood or reading, but cleaning his rifle. He worked with a slow, methodical intensity, his movements precise and deadly. He disassembled the weapon, oiled each part, and reassembled it with a focus that was absolute. The tight set of his jaw and the cold look in his eyes frightened Alara more than any shouted threat. It was the look of a man preparing for war. She watched him, her own fear a cold stone in her gut. With every careful motion of his hands, a wave of guilt washed over her, so powerful it threatened to drown her. She had done this. She had brought this danger to his door, to the one place in the world he had carved out for himself as a haven from its cruelties. He had saved her life, and in return, she was going to get him killed. The thought was unbearable. He had already lost one family to the malice of the outside world. She could not be the cause of his own death. The tension stretched between them for 2 days. A wire pulled taut to the breaking point. It finally snapped on the third night. Caleb was standing by the window, a silent silhouette against the moonlit snow, when Alara could bear it no longer. "You should take me back," she said, her voice a strained whisper in the quiet room. He did not turn. "What did you say?" "Take me to prosperity," she repeated, her words gaining a desperate strength. "Take me to the sheriff. Tell him you found me. Tell him whatever story you must. The poster, it offers a reward. You could take the money. You could have a new start, somewhere far away from here." He turned then, and the look on his face was one she had never seen before. It was not anger, not yet, but a deep and profound hurt, as if she had struck him. "Is that what you think this is about?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "A reward?" "No," she cried, standing up from her stool by the fire. "Of course not. It is about you living. Silas will not stop. He will send more men. He will come himself. They will kill you. Caleb, all for me. I am not worth your life." Her words were a desperate, clumsy attempt to protect him, the only way she knew how. She was trying to cut him loose from the anchor of her own misfortune. But that is not what he heard. He heard a rejection. He heard that she did not believe they could survive this together. He heard that, when faced with the first real test, she had lost faith in him, in them. A rare and terrible anger, born from that deep hurt, flashed in his eyes. "Not worth my life?" he shot back, taking a step toward her. "What kind of life do you think I was living before you fell against my door? Do you think this was living?" He swept his arm out, indicating the small, silent cabin. "This was not living. This was existing. This was waiting to die. I got up with the sun. I chopped wood. I hunted. I went to sleep. And every single day was the same as the one before it. A long, gray line stretching out to nowhere. The only thing I had to look forward to was the end of it." He stopped directly in front of her, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper, filled with a pain that stunned her into silence. "And then you came. You fell out of the storm, half dead and running from a monster. And for the first time in years, for the first time since I buried my wife and child, I felt something other than grief. I felt a reason to build the fire a little warmer, a reason to care if the sun came up tomorrow. You were not a burden, Ilara. You were a flicker of hope in a world I thought was made of nothing but darkness." He looked at her, his anger dissolving into a plea. "So do not tell me to take you back. Do not tell me to trade you for money. I am not just fighting for you. I am fighting for me. I am fighting for the first chance at a real life I have had since I lost everything." The raw honesty of his words shattered her resolve. Tears streamed down her face, tears of sorrow for his past and of shame for her own fear. This painful, terrible argument was the most honest conversation they had ever had. It cleared the poisoned air between them, burning away the guilt and fear, leaving only the hard, unshakable truth of their commitment. It was no longer about him helping her. It was about them, together. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest. He stood rigid for a moment, then his own arms came around her, holding her tightly, desperately. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary souls clinging to each other, a shared, silent vow passing between them. They would not let Silas win. They would not let the world break them. While they forged their pact in the heart of the mountains, the architect of their misery arrived in prosperity. Silas Croft stepped down from his private coach looking less like a man on a grim search and more like a visiting dignitary. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored wool coat and polished leather boots, his handsome face arranged in an expression of tasteful, aristocratic sorrow. He moved with an unshakable confidence, the easy assurance of a man for whom the world was a thing to be bent to his will. He took a room at the finest hotel in town, which was still a dusty, provincial establishment by his standards, and immediately set about charming the town's leadership. For the mine owner, there were expensive cigars and talk of future investments. For Sheriff Bartlett, there was a bottle of whiskey so fine it made the lawman's eyes water, and a subtle but unmistakable promise of a generous donation to his re-election fund. To all of them, he spun a masterful tale of tragic love. He spoke of his fiancée, his beloved Alara, as a fragile, delicate creature, prone to bouts of confusion after a childhood illness. He suggested she might have wandered off in a state of bewilderment, only to be taken advantage of by some opportunistic mountain dweller. "She is all I have in this world," he would say, his voice resonating with carefully practiced grief. "I just want her back, safe and sound." The town's leaders, blinded by his wealth and charisma, swallowed the story whole. He was a man of their world, a man of power and property. But in private, the charming mask came off. In his hotel room with Sheriff Bartlett, his demeanor became cold, his questions sharp and precise. "This half-breed, Blackwood," Silas said, pouring the sheriff another glass of whiskey. "Tell me about him." Bartlett, eager to please his wealthy new patron, spoke freely. "He is a loner, keeps to himself up on the mountain. His father was a white trapper, but his mother was an Indian. He is not welcome here." A cruel, thin smile touched Silas's lips. It was perfect. "So, a savage then," he said, the word dripping with contempt. "It is a classic story, is it not, Sheriff? An innocent, confused white woman, taken by a brute from the wilderness, defiled by him, no doubt." He let the ugly insinuation hang in the air, knowing it would take root in the fertile soil of the town's prejudice. He was an expert at manipulating the fears and hatreds of lesser men. He hired a half-dozen of the town's toughest and most desperate men, bounty hunters and drifters who would do anything for coin. He laid out a map on the table, pointing to the location of Caleb's cabin that Bartlett had provided. "I want her back," Silas told them, his voice now stripped of all pretense, as cold and hard as steel. "I do not care what condition he is in when you are done with him. In fact, I would prefer it if he resisted, vigorously. Retrieve my property. You will be well paid." Back at the cabin, the time for waiting was over. Caleb and Alara were no longer passive victims. They began to fortify their home. "He will send them before he comes himself," Caleb said, his voice grim. "He will not want to get his own hands dirty unless he has to." His first order of business was to teach Alara to shoot. He took her to a small clearing, set a tin can on a stump 50 yards away, and put the heavy rifle in her hands. "This is not for hunting," he told her, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This is for defense. You do not aim for a wing. You aim for the center of the mass. You shoot to stop the threat." She was a surprisingly quick study. Her fear, the life-or-death stakes of their situation, sharpened her focus to a razor's edge. She listened to his instructions, learning to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger gently, to account for the wind. The first few shots were wide, the recoil of the powerful rifle a violent, shocking force that slammed into her shoulder, leaving a deep ache. But she did not complain. She reloaded, set her jaw, and tried again. Finally, a shot rang out, and the tin can jumped off the stump. A clean hole punched through its middle. A strange, powerful feeling surged through her. The loud report of the gun, the smell of gunpowder, the violent but controllable power she held in her hands. It was terrifying, but it was also empowering. This was a feeling Silas had spent a lifetime trying to extinguish in her. She was no longer the helpless woman who had collapsed in the snow, a fragile doll to be broken. She was a survivor. Caleb watched her, a look of grim pride on his face. "Good," he said, the single word carrying more weight than a flowery speech. Again. Together, they worked to turn the cabin into a small fortress. They barred the single window with a thick log. They reinforced the door. Caleb showed her the different approaches to the cabin, the choke points, the places with clear lines of sight. They established a system of watches. One of them always awake, always listening. This practical, urgent work of survival forged their partnership into something unbreakable. They moved together with an unspoken understanding, their shared purpose a bond stronger than any vow. The attack came at dusk. 2 days later, 3 men, their courage fortified by Silas's whiskey and their greed stoked by the promise of his gold, decided to approach the cabin without waiting for the others. Caleb, on watch near the window, caught the faintest sound, the unnatural crunch of snow that told him it was a man, not an animal. "They are here," he said, his voice a low, calm whisper that sent a jolt of ice through Alara's veins. "Get down, by the hearth, and keep the skillet close." The fight was a brutal, chaotic blur of motion. It was not a clean, heroic battle from a dime novel. It was a desperate, ugly scramble of close-quarters violence. Caleb slipped out the door before they reached it, using the deepening shadows as cover. There was a shout, the thud of a body hitting the ground, and then silence. He had taken down 1 man, but the other 2 were on him. The cabin door burst inward with a splintering crash, and they spilled into the room, their faces illuminated by the firelight, twisted with aggression. The sanctity of their home was violently shattered. The small table was overturned, the air filled with grunts, curses, and the sound of struggle. Caleb met them with savage efficiency, moving with a speed and power that took them by surprise. He fought like a cornered wolf, using his fists, his feet, the very walls of his home as weapons, but he was outnumbered. One of the men, a large, bearded brute, broke away from the main struggle and saw Alara cowering by the hearth. A cruel grin spread across his face as he started toward her. "Look what we have here," he sneered. "The boss's pretty little bird." In that single, terrifying moment, all of Alara's fear, all the trauma of Silas's cruelty and the terror of her flight, crystallized into a single, sharp point of pure, cold rage. She was not a bird. She was not property, and she would not be taken. Remembering Caleb's instructions, her hand shot out and gripped the handle of the heavy cast-iron skillet that was sitting on the hearth, its surface still hot from their meager dinner. As the man lunged for her, she rose to her feet and swung it with all the strength in her body. The heavy iron connected with the side of his head with a sickening thud. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he went down in a heap, stunned and silent. Meanwhile, Caleb was locked in a life-or-death struggle with the 3rd man. They crashed against the wall, grappling for control of the man's knife. Caleb was stronger, but his opponent was desperate. With a final, vicious thrust, the man managed to plunge the blade deep into Caleb's side. A sharp cry of pain was torn from Caleb's throat. The hot, searing agony shocked him, but it also fueled him with a last surge of adrenaline. With a furious roar, He overpowered his attacker, slamming the man's head against the stone of the fireplace. The man went limp. The cabin fell into a sudden, deafening silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the ragged, desperate gasps for breath, and the slow, rhythmic dripping of blood onto the floorboards. They had survived, but the cost was terrible. 2 men lay dead on the floor of their home. A third was unconscious, and Caleb was leaning heavily against the wall, his face pale, one hand pressed to his side where a dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across his shirt. Alara scrambled to his side, her brief, violent rage replaced by a wave of pure terror. He slid down the wall, leaving a smear of red on the logs, and collapsed onto the floor. "Caleb!" she cried, her voice trembling. She knelt beside him, pressing her own hands over his, trying desperately to staunch the flow of blood. His breathing was shallow, his eyes glazed with pain. The immediate threat was over, but Silas was still out there. Caleb was grievously injured, and they were now killers. The line they had sworn they would never cross had been left far, far behind them in a pool of blood on the cabin floor. The world contracted to the 4 bloody walls of the cabin. The roar of the fight faded into a ringing in Alara's ears, replaced by the horrifyingly intimate sounds of Caleb's ragged breathing and the steady drip of his blood onto the floorboards. The room was a scene from a nightmare. Overturned furniture, the metallic smell of blood, and the still, silent forms of the men who had violated their home. For a single, paralyzing moment, she was frozen by the sheer horror of it all. Then, the adrenaline hit her like a physical blow. A strange, cold clarity washed over her, burning away the panic. The dead men did not matter. The wreckage did not matter. Only Caleb mattered. She flew to his side, her mind racing. The wound in his side was a deep, ugly gash, welling with dark blood that soaked through his shirt and her hands as she pressed against it. His face was slick with sweat, his skin taking on a pale, waxy sheen. "Alara!" he gasped, his voice thin and strained. "The fire! The knife!" She understood instantly. She ran to the hearth, her movements sure and swift, and thrust the tip of his long hunting knife into the heart of the glowing embers. While it heated, she took his smaller knife and tore strips from her own petticoat, the fine cotton a stark white against the grime and blood on her hands. The civilized fabric was a relic from another life. Now it would serve a more primal purpose. "Herbs," he gritted out, his eyes squeezed shut against a wave of pain. "On the shelf, yarrow." She remembered his lessons. Yarrow, he had told her, the warrior's herb. To staunch bleeding, she grabbed a handful of the dried, feathery leaves, her hands shaking only slightly. She returned to his side and gently pulled his hand away from the wound. With a deep, steadying breath, she packed the herbs directly into the gash, pressing down hard. Caleb cried out, a raw, strangled sound, and his body arched in agony. "I am sorry," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. But she did not lessen the pressure. She had to be the strong one now. The delicate, frightened woman she had been was a ghost. In her place was a protector, a healer, forged in the crucible of this terrible night. When the knife was glowing a dull red, she took a piece of leather for him to bite down on. He shook his head, his eyes meeting hers, filled with a mixture of agony and a fierce, terrible pride in her. He would face this without screaming. She took the knife from the fire, the heat scorching the air. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, the horrific reality of what she was about to do threatening to overwhelm her. Then she saw the life fading from his eyes, and her resolve hardened into steel. She pressed the glowing tip of the knife to the edges of the wound. The stench of burning flesh filled the cabin, a sickening, acrid smell that would haunt her forever. Caleb's body went rigid, a low groan of pure torment escaping his lips, but he did not cry out. She worked quickly, her movements precise, her mind detached from the horror of the act. When it was done, she threw the knife aside with a clatter and quickly bandaged the wound with the clean strips of her petticoat. her hands now moving with the practiced calm of a surgeon. The immediate crisis was over. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish ooze. He was alive, exhausted and trembling. Alara slumped against him, her strength finally failing her. He was delirious with pain, but his hand found hers, his grip weak but present. It was an anchor. She had done it. She had saved him. But the night's gruesome work was not finished. The bodies could not stay. They were a violation, a testament to the violence that had shattered their peace. When Caleb had regained a sliver of strength, enough to stand while leaning on her, they undertook the traumatic task together. He was a dead weight against her, his breath coming in shallow pants. But he was resolute. They dragged the first man to the door, his dead eyes staring at the ceiling. Alara's stomach churned, but she focused on the mechanics of the task, on the pull of her muscles and the bracing of her legs. They pushed him out into the cold, a dark shape against the snow, and went back for the other. The third man, the one she had struck with the skillet, was stirring, groaning. They bound his hands and feet and dragged him out as well, leaving him to the mercy of the cold. There was no pity in her heart, only a grim, cold finality. When it was done, they stood in the doorway of their ravaged home, the cold night air a balm on their fevered skin. Alara looked down at her hands. They were covered in blood, both Caleb's and that of his attackers. These were the same hands Silas had once criticized for being too delicate, too soft for anything but pouring tea. Now they knew how to pack a wound, how to cauterize flesh, how to swing a weapon. They were the hands of a healer and a killer. The duality terrified her, but it also imbued her with a grim sense of her own power. She was no longer a piece of property to be traded. She was a survivor, in the truest, most brutal sense of the word. They both knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of the final act. Silas would not be deterred by the loss of 3 hired thugs. He would see it as a personal insult, a challenge to his authority. He would come himself. "We have to leave," Alara whispered, the words tasting like defeat. Caleb, propped against the doorframe, slowly shook his head. "Where would we go? I cannot travel far. The high passes are still deep with snow. Running is just a slower way to die." He looked out into the darkness, towards the path that led down to prosperity. "No, the fight is not over. It is coming here. We will not run from it. We will meet it." The decision settled between them, heavy and irrevocable. They would make their final stand here, in the place that was their home. They would fight on their own terms, using their knowledge of this land as their shield and their sword. The cabin was no longer just a home. It was a fortress. The next few days were a blur of tense, focused preparation. Caleb was too weak to do much more than sit by the fire, but his mind was sharp, his will unbroken. He became the strategist, and Alara became his hands and feet, his soldier. He was weakened, but resolute, and a new dynamic formed between them. She would change his dressings, the angry red of the cauterized wound a stark reminder of how close she had come to losing him. She would brew him broth and spoon-feed it to him when he was too tired to lift his head. At night, they did not talk of a future they might never see. They talked of tactics. "The trail from the south is the only clear approach," he would say, his voice weak but clear. "There is a narrow pass between 2 rock faces, a perfect choke point." He taught her how to build a deadfall trap, a massive log propped up with a trigger rope, positioned over the narrowest part of the trail. He instructed her on how to build snares, not for rabbits, but for men, loops of rope hidden in the snow, designed to trap a foot and bring a man down. She worked tirelessly, her body aching, her mind a razor-sharp tool. She was no longer just following instructions. She was learning, understanding the cruel logic of this fight. During these tense days and long, dark nights, the last of their barriers fell away. The desperation, the shared danger, the stark reality that these might be their last days on Earth, stripped away all pretense. One night, as she sat by his cot, keeping watch while he slept a feverish, fitful sleep, he reached for her hand. His eyes were open, lucid, and filled with a love that was as fierce and untamed as the mountains around them. He pulled her down to him, and their mouths met, not with the desperate hunger of their first kiss, but with a deep, profound tenderness that was an affirmation of everything they were fighting for. They made love on the narrow cot, a quiet, desperate clinging to life in the face of imminent death. It was not an act of gentle romance, but a fierce and sacred vow, a confirmation that what they had found together was real and worth dying for. The final confrontation arrived on a cold, gray morning. 3 days after the first attack, a lone hawk circled high overhead in a sky the color of lead. Silas Croft, his patience exhausted and his narcissistic rage at a boiling point, had come to end this himself. He was not alone. With him were Sheriff Bartlett, looking deeply uncomfortable, and 2 more of his hired henchmen. But when they reached the small clearing, they found the cabin silent and seemingly empty. "He has run," Silas spat, furious at being denied his confrontation. "Maybe we should just go back, Mr. Croft," Bartlett said, his eyes nervously scanning the silent, watching trees. "The job is done. She is gone." "She is not gone," Silas said, his voice a low snarl. "She is mine, and I do not leave my property behind." A shot rang out from the ridge above them. A chip of bark exploded from the tree next to Silas's head. Everyone dove for cover. The fight was on, but it was not the fight they had expected. Elara was hidden in a rocky crevice high above the trail, the rifle resting on a steady ledge. She was terrified, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her hands were steady. She did not need to hit them. She just needed to keep their heads down. Another shot, and another, each one accurate enough to make them stay behind their cover of rocks and fallen logs. While she kept them pinned down, Caleb, moving with a pained slowness, put his own plan into motion. He had crept through the woods to a position above the narrow pass. As the 2 henchmen tried to circle around to flank Elara's position, Caleb used the last of his strength to dislodge the keystone holding back a small rock slide he had prepared. With a deep groan, a cascade of rocks and snow tumbled down, completely blocking the path and separating the 2 men from Silas and the sheriff. One of the henchmen, now isolated, pushed on alone, trying to find another way up the ridge. He moved into a thicket of young pines, and Caleb, who had anticipated this, was waiting. He rose from the shadows like a wraith, his knife in his hand. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. Sheriff Bartlett had seen enough. This was no simple retrieval. This was a battle against ghosts who knew every rock and tree. A coward at heart, he decided to save his own skin. He began to retreat, scrambling back the way they had come. In his panic, he forgot Caleb's warnings about the terrain. His foot plunged through the snow, and a loop of rope tightened around his ankle, jerking him off his feet and leaving him dangling upside down from a tree branch, swearing and helpless. The fight was now distilled to its core. Silas, enraged and alone, saw a flicker of movement near a rocky ledge below Elara's position. It was Caleb, weakened by his wound, his movements slow. Silas charged, his handsome face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. The final confrontation was a brutal, personal affair. Caleb, still weak, was at a severe disadvantage. Silas, fueled by a lifetime of unchallenged authority and narcissistic rage, was relentless. He slammed Caleb against the rocks, landing blow after blow. "You filthy animal," Silas hissed, his voice venomous. "Did you really think you could steal from me? She is a thing, a piece of property, my property." He grabbed Caleb by the throat, forcing him to his knees. "I am going to enjoy killing you slowly, and then I will take her back and teach her a lesson she will never forget." Just as Silas raised a rock to deliver the final, crushing blow, A voice cut through the air. "Silas, let him go!" It was Alara. She stood 20 feet away, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She had scrambled down from the ridge, but in her haste, the rifle had slipped from her grasp, tumbling into a deep snowdrift. She was unarmed. Silas turned, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. He released Caleb, who slumped to the ground, gasping for air. "Ah, my love," Silas said, his voice a silken mockery. "You have come to your senses. So good of you to join us. Now you can watch as I dispose of your pet." He took a step toward Caleb, but Alara moved to block his path. "It is over. Silas, leave us be." He laughed, a cold, empty sound. "Over? My dear, it is just beginning." He started toward her, his intentions clear in his eyes. He believed her to be helpless, the same fragile woman he had intended to break. But she was not that woman anymore. Her hand was not empty. She was holding a heavy, yard-long branch, one she had found and sharpened to a point days ago. A makeshift spear she had kept hidden. As Silas lunged for her, abandoning all pretense, she did not retreat. She stood her ground. She held the spear with both hands, planted her feet, and aimed for his chest. It was a raw, desperate act of self-preservation, an act of pure love for the man bleeding on the ground behind her. Silas, in his arrogance, did not even see it until it was too late. He ran directly onto the sharpened point. The spear impaled him. A look of profound, utter shock crossed his face. He looked down at the wooden stake protruding from his chest, then up at Alara, his mouth opening as if to speak. No words came out. He stumbled backward, his fine leather boots slipping on the icy rock of the ledge. For a moment, he teetered on the edge, his arms windmilling, a stunned expression on his face. And then he was gone, falling into the deep, snow-filled ravine below. A deafening silence fell over the forest, broken only by the mournful cry of the hawk circling overhead. The threat was gone. Justice in its most primal, violent form had been served. But there was no triumph. There was only the hollow, shaking ache of survival. Alara dropped the bloody spear and stared at her hands. Caleb struggled to his feet, pulling her into his arms. They stood there, bruised, bloodied, and utterly exhausted. Two survivors amidst the wreckage of their sanctuary. The grim reality of what they had been forced to do. The lives they had been forced to take to be free, washed over them in a silent, devastating wave. They clung to each other, the only two souls in the world who could possibly understand. The silence that followed the fall was more profound than any sound. It was a silence that absorbed the echoes of the fight, the shouts, the pain, and left behind a vast and hollow emptiness. For a long moment, Caleb and Alara simply stood on the rocky ledge, the cold wind whipping at their torn clothes, their bodies bruised and aching, their souls utterly exhausted. The world felt unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. The threat that had hunted them, that had driven them to the very edge of their humanity, was gone, vanished into the silent depths of the ravine. But there was no triumph in their hearts, only the cold, heavy weight of survival. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, they turned to the business of the living. Their first task was the sheriff, still dangling ignominiously from the tree branch, his face purple, his curses having long since given way to panicked pleas. Caleb, leaning heavily on Alara, cut him down. Bartlett collapsed into the snow, a sputtering, terrified man stripped of all his blustering authority. He looked from Caleb's grim face to Alara's cold, steady gaze, and the last of his arrogance evaporated. He had seen Silas Croft's madness firsthand. He had seen the viciousness of the attack and the desperate, brutal courage of their defense. He knew this was not a kidnapping. It was a war for survival, and he had been on the wrong side. "He was crazy," Bartlett stammered, rubbing his swollen ankle. "He would have killed you both. I saw it. It was self-defense. All of it." This terrified confession was their unexpected bridge back to the world of men. Caleb looked at Alara, a silent question passing between them. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. They had a choice, vengeance or peace. They chose peace. "Here is what you will tell them." "Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "You will tell them that Silas Croft and his men were arrogant fools who did not know these mountains. You will say they argued amongst themselves, that their own greed and violence, combined with the harshness of the terrain, is what killed them. A rock slide, a fall, plausible accidents, a story this town will be more than happy to believe, so they can forget this whole ugly business and go back to counting their money." Bartlett looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "And you?" "We were never a part of it," Alara said, her voice as hard as the granite beneath her feet. "We are who we said we were, a trapper and his wife who saw nothing." The sheriff, desperate to save his own skin and preserve the tatters of his reputation, agreed without a moment's hesitation. The pact was sealed there in the snow, amongst the dead, a lie that would pave the way for a difficult truth. The journey back to prosperity was a stark and surreal procession. Caleb and Alara walked ahead, supporting each other. Behind them, a humbled Sheriff Bartlett organized the grim task of retrieving the bodies, a somber parade bringing the violence that Silas had unleashed back to the town that had so eagerly welcomed him. Their arrival was a stark contrast to their first visit. This time, there were no muttered slurs, no hostile glares. The townsfolk emerged from their shops and saloons, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and a morbid curiosity. They saw Alara, her face bruised and her clothes torn, walking not with the fear of a captive, but with the weary dignity of a victor. They saw Caleb, wounded and leaning on her for support, not as a savage, but as a man who had faced down a monster and survived. Sheriff Bartlett, true to his word, told the story they had concocted. He spoke of Croft's arrogance, of infighting among the hired men, of a tragic and foolish end in the unforgiving mountains. The story was thin, but it was the story the town wanted. It absolved them of their own prejudice, of their willingness to believe the worst of Caleb and the best of a wealthy stranger. There was no official justice, no trial. Silas Croft's name became a quiet curse, a cautionary tale, but a clear and undeniable shift had occurred in the town's perception. The whispers that followed Caleb and Alara now were not of contempt, but of a grudging, astonished respect. Alara, in particular, was seen in a new light. She was no longer the fragile, stolen bride from the poster. She was the woman who had survived the mountain, a formidable and unbroken spirit. They spent 2 weeks in prosperity, a necessary purgatory. The town doctor, who had once refused to travel to Caleb's cabin, now tended to his wound with a diligent and respectful air, offering his services without hesitation. They took a room at the small hotel, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they slept in a real bed, though their sleep was haunted by nightmares. The quiet of the town felt strange and stifling after the profound silence of the mountain, but it was a time of necessary healing, for both body and soul. During this time, Alara bought a single sheet of paper, a pen, and a small pot of ink. She sat by the window of their hotel room for a long time, looking out at the muddy street, before she began to write. It was a letter to her father. It was not a letter of anger or accusation, but one of finality, of emancipation. "Father," she wrote, her script clear and steady, "I am alive, and I am well. I write to you not to ask for anything, but to inform you of my decision. The life you had arranged for me is one I could not accept. I have found a new life, one of my own choosing. I will not be returning. I hope that you will find peace, but my path is now my own. I am no longer your daughter in any way that matters to the world of debts and contracts. I am free." She folded the letter and enclosed with it the few dollars she had left from the sale of a small locket she had managed to keep hidden. It was not a payment for the life he had given her, but a final, symbolic severing of all ties. It was her declaration of independence, signed and sealed. When Caleb's wound was healed enough for travel, they faced their own difficult choice. They could leave, head west, and start a new life where no one knew their names or their bloody history. Or they could return to the mountain, to the cabin that held so many traumatic memories. "We could be anyone we want, anywhere else," Alara said one evening, the unspoken promise of a clean slate hanging in the air. Caleb was silent for a long time, looking out the window towards the dark silhouette of the peaks. "He would win, then," he said quietly. "Silas, if we run from that place, then he will have succeeded in driving us from our home. His memory will have the final victory." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "That cabin is more than just a building. Alara, it is the place where I found you. It is the place where you saved my life. It is the crucible where we were forged. It is soaked in blood and pain. Yes, but it is also where we found each other. It is our home." She knew he was right. To run would be to live forever as fugitives from their own past. Returning was an act of defiance. It was an act of healing. The process of rebuilding was slow and therapeutic. They returned to the cabin in the early days of the thaw, when the first green shoots of spring were beginning to push through the melting snow. The cabin was cold and silent, haunted by the ghosts of the violence it had witnessed. But they faced the ghosts together. They started with the broken door, Caleb showing Alara how to plane the wood, how to fit the new planks together. They worked side by side, their movements falling into a comfortable, practiced rhythm. They scrubbed the dark bloodstains from the floorboards, a grim and necessary baptism, washing away the last physical traces of their attackers. They gathered the few belongings the men had left behind, a tarnished flask, a worn set of cards, and burned them in the fire, watching until nothing but ash remained. Each act was a small but significant reclamation of their space, of their life. They worked in a silence that was no longer charged with fear or desire, but filled with a deep and abiding love. The intense, desperate passion of their survival days softened and deepened into a steady, quiet affection. They learned the landscape of each other's souls. They still had dark moments. Sometimes, Alara would wake with a start. The image of Silas's face as he fell burned into her mind. Caleb, too, had nights where he would cry out, reliving the moment the knife slid into his side, or older, deeper pains. But they were no longer alone in their darkness. They would hold each other, offering comfort and understanding without the need for words, until the shadows receded and the quiet peace of their shared life returned. One afternoon, while cleaning the last of the debris from the hearth, Alara found it, the small, carved wooden bird, the one Caleb had made for his daughter, had been knocked from the mantel during the fight. It lay in the dust, its delicate wing broken. She picked it up, her heart aching for the man and the child she had never known. That evening, by the firelight, she took out her small sewing kit and, with tiny, neat stitches, carefully mended the delicate wooden joint, binding the wing back into place. She showed it to him, holding it out in the palm of her hand. Caleb took the bird, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her repair. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion, and he saw the act for what it truly was, a mending of his own broken past. And he finally told her. He told her the full story, not just of the loss, but of the life. He spoke of Lena, of her laughter and the way she had taught him to see the beauty in the small things. He told her about Sarah, about her wild black hair and her insatiable curiosity, about the joy of holding her small hand in his. He spoke of the devastating grief, a raw wound that had never truly healed, and, as he spoke, for the first time in Alara's presence, Caleb Blackwood cried. He wept with the deep, shuddering sobs of a man unburdening himself of a lifetime of sorrow. Alara did not speak. She simply moved to his side and held him, sharing his grief not as an outsider, but as his partner, his equal, his home. The story's final emotional climax was not a grand event, but a quiet one. True spring finally arrived, chasing the last of the snow from the valley and coaxing a carpet of green from the forest floor. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and new life. They were standing outside the cabin one evening, watching the sun set behind the peaks, when Caleb handed her a small box he had carved from birch wood. She opened it. Inside, there was no ring of gold or silver. Instead, nestled on a bed of soft moss, was a collection of seeds: beans, squash, corn, and a small packet of wildflower seeds. It was a promise of a future, a promise of putting down roots in the very ground that had seen so much death, and of nurturing life. "I love you, Ilara," he said, his voice simple and true, stripped of all artifice. "I never thought I would say those words again, but you have brought the spring back to my life." "And I love you, Caleb," she answered, her own voice thick with emotion. "You taught me how to be free." There was no official wedding, no ceremony witnessed by a preacher or a judge. Their commitment was a quiet vow made only to each other, under the vast and watchful sky of the mountains that had both tested and saved them. The final scene of their story was one of peace. It showed them working together in the rich, dark soil beside the cabin, turning the earth for their first garden. Ilara's hands, once soft and delicate, were now calloused and strong, her face kissed by the sun. Caleb's face, though still scarred by life, had lost its haunted, guarded edge. As he looked at her, a real and open smile touched his lips, a smile that reached his eyes and lit them from within. They were no longer defined by the tragedies they had escaped or the violence they had endured. They were defined, now and forever, by the love and the life they were choosing to build together, day by day. They had found their justice not in a courtroom or at the end of a rope, but in their own survival, in their own happiness. They stood together, looking out over the valley, a united front against the world, their hearts and their home finally, truly, their own. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.